Today I'm going to be going over my 5 biggest tips for buying a home in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hey, what's going on? I'm Dave Domingo. I'm a real estate investor and a licensed broker. Tip number 1, budget with the end in mind. By this I mean before you buy a home, think of the security position you need to be on the back end after you own it. Practically what that means is I recommend your monthly mortgage payment sit somewhere between a quarter to a third of your monthly income. This gives you plenty of room to both handle your monthly mortgage payment, all the costs of owning a home, things that could occur unexpectedly, on top of your other day-to-day, month-to-month expenses. And this adds up very quickly, and so ensuring that you're not at the maximum of your budget means that you have wiggle room in the back end, and things change. For example, just this year, taxes went up where I live, and my monthly mortgage payment increased by about $400 a month just to match the new taxes. So start with the end in mind and then work from there. The next tip is a bit of a tactical one. That's coordinate with your bank in advance before doing a wire. Especially if you're buying from out of state, most people pay their due diligence funds and earnest money deposits using a wire transfer. And I had a client before who no longer lives in the original town as his local bank that he still currently banks with, and he didn't realize that when he goes to wire the due diligence fund, that the bank requires him to be there in person, which was not going to happen. He was active duty military living in Texas, and he could not get up to the Pacific Northwest. And due diligence funds and earnest money deposits are both time sensitive things, and so you don't want to fall out of contract because you failed to meet the timeline on that simply because of a logistical hurdle. Even so, you should have an alternate payment method lined up just in case. For example, overnighting a check. My next tip for finding the right place to call home is the search for an area that aligns with your lifestyle values. A lot of times when we're looking at new areas, we might find some pros and cons videos on the internet, and they start talking about some very surface level things, but it doesn't always settle the question or the underlying issue of, am I going to be happy if I live there? And so the way to tackle that aspect is to compare everything to what you value. For example, if you value convenience and accessibility, then you need to gauge how far and how accessible places like your job or your hobbies are going to be from where you live. Another one's going to be social connectivity. Obviously, if you live close to downtown, there's plenty of social events. And if you live in the suburbs or even further out, there might be nobody around your age. And this actually happened to me. The first place I lived at was basically a community meant for married families with 1 to 2 kids, roughly elementary and middle school age. And so I felt quite left out, and for the most part it was hard to relate to a lot of people that I lived by. You still need to know the pros and cons and the surface level information, but this is ultimately going to help you break the ties and feel much more comfortable that an area is right for you. My 4th tip is to determine your exit strategies from the beginning. Now, similar to the first point, this is thinking of the end in mind, except instead of budgeting, it's more so, how do you see yourself and your time in this home coming to its conclusion? Are you gonna sell the home? Are you gonna rent it out? Or is this where you're gonna live as your forever home? All 3 of these become pretty important factors in the home buying process. And the reason being is it changes what you prioritize. For example, if you're planning on selling a home, then before you buy it, you need to start thinking through the considerations in the event that you were to list it. Or are there any improvements that you need to make or timeline considerations? Let's say you know that the city has a highway plan for behind your home. Like, this will impact your resale value. So you would probably want to buy only if you plan on selling before that occurs. And also, you should consider the capital gains exemption for if you live in a property for 2 out of the past 5 years and then decide to sell it. This can imply huge tax savings, but if you wait longer than 5 years to sell it, then you no longer qualify for it. So this is probably most applicable to considering how your job overlays with the exact area you're moving to. And separately, if this is going to be your forever home, then you have to understand that whenever you pass away, the property is going to get inherited by your heirs unless otherwise stated in a will. Unless you're married, then the ownership goes to the spouse, but then for the spouse, it would go to the heirs. So these are all just things to consider. My last tip for buying a home in Raleigh is optimize for the decision-making process. And by this, I mean buying a home is truly a decision-making process. You're managing your goals and your resources against environmental factors that you don't have any control over. Things like interest rates, the market, other buyers, things like that. So you should approach this similar to if you're making a huge business decision, which is involve others. Go it as a group. Make sure you have somebody that can act as a sounding board. And if a decision is particularly emotional, as long as time allows for it, then you want to gain distance from the emotion so that you could really apply your logic to make the best decision for you. As a bonus sub-tip, if you're married, then consider having a veto rule implemented. It can be very hard to find a home where both spouses are happy with every single aspect of the home, but each person is going to have their non-negotiables. So you should design your approach or your process to take that into account. Also, part of your job in decision making is to identify and then manage or mitigate risk. Risk could include timeline, repairs, how much do we offer on the due diligence fund, which is a non-refundable deposit? When do we back out of a deal and for what reason? Or even just not knowing where the market's going, right? Imagine you bought a home in 2007 and then you had the unfortunate luck of running into the crash in 2008. So you got to think about these things ahead because none of us could really project the future. And so you should build in these risk mitigation measures in advance. A lot of times this means either have more money in reserves or just buy a more affordable house. The one thing I would generally recommend is before submitting a big offer, just to sleep on it. It's easier to think through the problem and get distance from the emotion after a good night's rest. Now, obviously, if you're seeing a home in the morning and the listing agent says final offers must be submitted by 5 p.m., then that's an exception, but generally speaking, I would recommend sleeping on it beforehand. All right, so those are my 5 biggest tips. I hope they help, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.